Hi, good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us after lunch. Before we begin, I just wanted to thank the AMC for hosting us and for providing a forum for us to have this discussion. And I'd also like to thank my lovely panelists for accepting the invitation to participate and then making the time and the effort to travel despite professional and personal obligations. So I'm Gabriel Martinez. I'm the Curator of Education at the Museum of Latin American Art. And my panelists today are Selene Preciado, or my co-moderator, sorry, is Selene Preciado, who's an independent curator and also the program assistant at the Yeti Foundation. And then we have Carmen Ramos here, who is the Deputy Chief Curator and Curator of Latino Art at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. Then we have Mia Lopez, who is Assistant Curator at the DePaul Museum. And then Lisa Corona, who is an artist and also an independent curator. Okay. So, as I stated, I'm the Curator of Education at the Museum of Latin American Art. I'm also an artist. I'm a printmaker and a painter, and so it was really exciting to meet other artist curators here at the conference. The title of our panel today is Latinx Identity, Mentorship, and Representation. In this panel, we are not going to necessarily interrogate this label. What we're going to do is that we're going to use the identity of Latinx in order to question issues of representation and diversity in the museum field, specifically focusing on the curatorial and executive levels. So as we go through this panel, I'd like to ask you all to reflect on what diversity might mean to you, perhaps going beyond identifiers such as race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, or even regional identities, but instead focus on ways that our experiences perhaps inform our curatorial practices in different ways. So in tackling this project and in the spirit of collaboration, the way that I personally work best, I invited my good friend and colleague, Selene Preciado, in order to discuss and sort of determine the topic that we were going to talk about today. And we decided to focus on issues of mentorship. And mentorship as defined by opportunities for learning about the tasks that are required in our field, also different strategies, and also the culture of the museum field. Not merely in order to survive in the museum, but in order to ensure success and growth, and also create impact and change within the field. So, what do Selene and I have in common? We actually have a lot. We used to be neighbors, so we basically live together. But also, we share a mentor who is Cecilia Fajardo-Hill, who is a curator of Radical Women. So through Cecilia's mentorship, and she's in the center there, we received a lot of opportunities, a lot of training, but also a lot of modeling in ways to create collaborative and horizontal models for curating.
So speaking about Cecilia, I think that her way of mentoring us has been very impactful and inspiring because she has a horizontal mode of working and collaborating with us. So she didn't only create opportunities for us to also develop professionally in the museum. I worked with Cecilia and Gabriela at the Museum of Latin American Art a few years ago. And that was our team also with Idur Alonso in the bottom left. So I think that model was very inspiring, and we are trying in our own practice to replicate it as well.
And some of the images that you see up there are some of the people that have advocated for us in school and then in the field as well. And everything from being just supportive and, in my case, ensuring that I didn't drop out of graduate school because I was miserable for a while, but also basically challenging us and things like that. So.
So also, this is a way of introducing the whole panel. So we have a few slides that are sort of setting the questions that we're going to have. And I don't know if should I advance my? Oh, sorry. So this is just so you wake up after lunch. And this was just an exchange that I had on Facebook about a month ago. And we put this up because it made us think, and also it made me question personally my practice and what it means to be a curator, and raise the question if, as a female curator, as a curator of color, is it my responsibility to be a mentor to other people? Is it my responsibility to do certain things? Is it required, or how do I feel about it? So this is certainly, to me, it was shocking because I thought that, yes, it's part of my responsibility, and to me, it has always been a given because of the people that I have had the privilege to work with. So to me, it was shocking a little bit to see that other people don't think this way. And this just happened a month ago, so then, yeah, this happened. So this is like the setup for our panel. And then we have this too. We have a few slides from the Melon Foundation study from 2015 that are just, and we can come back to see specific numbers, but these are just, so you can see the difference between white and minority representation in the museum field, and also you'll see that we are the 3%, and we're labeled as Hispanic, but we personally don't use that label. The H word it's passé. And then also, this graph in particular was very interesting to me because you'll see that it's majority female. The colors are, blue for female, red for male. But at the same time, we know that these percentages are actually lower positions, administrative and not managerial. And this is to set up the context. Gabriel and I work in Los Angeles. So as you all know, it's majority population Latino, yet the people that work in the museum field are not represented. And we thought that even though this is specific to Los Angeles, it's comparable to cities, major cities in the East Coast, like New York, DC, and also Chicago. So I think that it still applies nationwide. So, I don't know what's
So we're also going to talk about models that exist already in different programs that we have personally been involved with that do provide these opportunities for mentorship, and then we're going to provide examples also of more unofficial or underground ways that we also work in that way. And then our panelists are each going to share their own personal stories about how they came to the curatorial field.
Yeah, so don't be bummed out just yet. So, there are certain initiatives like the Melon Foundation's initiative for diversifying the curatorial field, and I just added a couple of pictures and statistics. But I want to point out that the differences between the three examples that I'm giving. The Melon is for curatorial. The newly launched For Foundations initiative is for museum leadership, so it's not the same thing as only curatorially focused. And then the Yeti Foundation, Yeti Multicultural Undergraduate Internship that just celebrated its 25th anniversary last year. And working at the Yeti, I was actually hired to work on Pacific Standard Time LA, but I stayed, and since last year, I've had the privilege to manage the internal program at the Getty. So the Getty Foundation gives grants to LA organizations, and also we have interns at the Getty. So we have between 18 to 24. This year is going to be a record. It's the largest number of interns that the Getty has had internally. So between the LA County interns and supported by the Getty, the interns at the Getty, and also the LA Arts Commission has a sister program that also includes performing arts. So between the three sort of arms of this initiative, there's about 200 interns working in LA organizations during the summer. So this was created in 1993 in the aftermath of the LA riots. And what is very important to me is that the initiative, yes, is to diversify the field, and what is crucial is not only curatorial, the interns get positions in all of the departments of museums, so it can be communications, development. But when I found out this, it created an impact on me that it was not only to diversify the field, but since its inception, it was thought to be an opportunity for the community to know that they have a space in the museum, so that the museum welcomes them. And to me, this is very important. And we have alumni here present also, so a shout out. We're very proud of this program, and I'm really happy to now be part of the program, and not as an intern, but in a managerial role. And so, of course, part of my role is, logistics and making sure the interns are fine and everyone is set up and everything. But as I took on the personal role, I see 3 points that I want to do as part of also my own practice. So since I am an independent curator, I'm a resource to them, and I know the LA organization, so I try to guide them through whatever questions they need. I connect them with professionals, not only at the Getty, but also outside the Getty. And then the third point that is very important is that because the Getty has a very particular mission and internal culture, the interns sometimes experience culture shock. So I feel like I am a resource for them to work through any of these issues.
And we're really lucky that we have the Getty program in Los Angeles, but don't feel disappointed or like it's a big challenge if you don't have that program, because we're also going to talk about different ways. So I am lucky enough to work in a museum whose focus is mainly modern and contemporary Latin American art, which is wonderful and challenging in its own way. And as a curator of education, when I say that Cecilia Fajardo Hill really provided mentorship and changed my life, it's because she really did change the course of my career. So I came into the museum field as an educator, which is pretty common for a woman of color, right? Right after graduate school, and I just thought, oh, okay, well, let me try working museums, see how well I like it. And after working there for 2 years, Cecilia came in about a year after I was hired. And the model that she provided for us was that we all collaborated on curating exhibitions. And we were all welcome to just kind of throw out any random ideas. So one day I said, well, I want to do an entirely interactive exhibition, right? We want to do something interactive. And at first she was kind of like, no. But about a month later, she comes to me and she said, you know what, I responded too quickly. She said, why don't you give it a shot? Curate an interactive exhibition. If it's successful, we'll continue using that model and we'll try to implement it across the board. And if it's a failure, well then, we know it's not going to work out. So she's the person who gave me my first opportunity to curate, and so I've been doing that now for the past 8 years, so I'm really excited about that. Within the Museum of Latin American Art, because it is so focused on modern contemporary Latino, Latinx, and Latin American art, but we have a really diverse community. Part of my sort of mission is to also include different aspects of the community. So because I am the curator of education, I can get away with a lot, kind of fudging those lines between how we present exhibitions. So what I do is I focus on creating a dialogue between works of art from our permanent collection and then work by local artists. And I've also had the opportunity to work with emerging curators as young as middle school. So that's been really exciting. So for example, here you'll see a project that we did with local high school students. What we did is that we reached out to our teen volunteers, we reached out to different high schools in the area, and we reached out to our local LGBTQ center, and we recruited a group of 5 students who then had their first curatorial experience. And out of those students, 2 of them actually are now art history majors who are looking to become curators, which is very exciting. And I've also had the opportunity to mentor a lot of young college students and graduate students as well. And people come to me. I'm very lucky because the students that do come to me, it's because they're super motivated about their culture, about how they want to be represented, and they also want to make sure that they are reflecting their community accurately. So for example, this is a picture of an exhibition opening at the Museum of Latin American Art. So you'll see really how the audience really does reflect the greater community. So now we're gonna move on to our panelists. So we're gonna start with Carmen Ramos.
Good afternoon. It's so wonderful to be here. Thank you to the AMC for organizing this conference in this beautiful city. I've been telling my friends that I want to become an expatriate, so I want to become a Canadian. And I also want to thank Gabriela and Selene for inviting me to be part of this panel. It's been just a pleasure talking to you ladies over the phone and meeting. It's been really wonderful, so I'm really happy to be here. So what I want to do with my 10 minutes is that I want to raise some points about the Melon Study that are not raised in the Melon Study, so the issues that the Melon Study doesn't address, which is the root causes to the racial imbalance that exists in the museum industry today. And I'm not trying to critique the Melon Study. It was not set out to do that. It really just set to diagnose sort of where we are, but it doesn't really address how we got here. So why are there so few Latinos in impact-making positions? Only 3% in curatorial, conservation, and education positions, according to the study. I believe that there are both structural and attitudinal factors that make the museum less a place for us. These factors have made me realize that Latinx museum professionals, especially those in curatorial, you can have our first slide, that we're really here against the odds. Really, the deck is stacked against us. And if we really want to change those odds, we must, in part, invest in mentorship and other programs of support catered to future Latinx leaders. So what are those obstacles to creating a robust Latino presence in the museum industry? I'm just going to delineate 3 general areas. We can have the first slide. Many, but not all of us, come from working class backgrounds, a reality that has many ripple effects in an art world whose foundation is economic privilege. So let's just look at it from the perspective of internships, which is the backbone of the museum industry, particularly in curatorial. So many of us got our start there. Yet historically, the vast majority of these are unpaid, making it difficult, if not impossible, for working class candidates to benefit from these opportunities. So without experience, how do you even enter the pipeline? And the economic challenges really continue even after you get a job, given the low wages of the museum industry. It's difficult for working class people who have little to no inherited family wealth to really have a stable life and be a museum professional. The other more fundamental facet to being working class, or better put poor, which is a term that we don't like to use, is that generally speaking, you come from a socially and economically at-risk group, right? And you're more than likely to attend a failing public school, you're more than likely to be raised in a challenging context. I, for one, was raised in the so-called inner city at the height of the crack epidemic in New York. That's my background, And needless to say that many of my age peers are not with me in the middle class and professional world that I now inhabit. They're just not there, the people that I grew up with, In this at-risk context, it's hard for young people to become successfully college-bound, which is necessary for a museum career. Another big macro issue is if we look at museums as a whole, and not just those located in liberal centers. For the most part, Latinos or their experiences are not represented in the museum. And we should all think back on Michelle Obama's comments during the reopening of the Whitney and also in the unveiling of her portrait at the National Portrait Gallery. And I'm just paraphrasing her. But she said things like, "I never expected my portrait to be painted or to be hung in a museum. Kids less than a mile from this museum don't feel like this place is for them." So my question is, how can young Latino museum professionals imagine themselves in museums if they don't see themselves in museums, right? So that's really important. The second obstacle, go to the next slide, that I'd like to address is the academy. The academy that trains us is often not welcoming or able to support our areas of interest. And the Melon Study does mention this in passing. And I'm speaking here specifically about Latinos who are interested in Latinx art or other racialized and understudied subjects, who in many cases have to fight for the right to study their chosen subject. And part of the issue is that our underrepresentation in the museum industry is replicated in every arena of life. So it's not just the museum, it's the world, right? So in the academy, there are very few programs that offer courses in Latinx art. We can go to the next slide. So here are some statistics. Out of 812 undergraduate programs and 250 graduate programs, only 12 offer focused courses in Latinx art. Right? I don't need to say anything. The statistics speak for themselves. The third and final obstacle that I'd like to address is how we're treated once we're in the institution. You can go to the next slide. So once we enter the museum industry, we often encounter obstacles within and outside of our institutions. And I want to give a few personal anecdotes here. So in my first significant curatorial job, there was so much skepticism and consternation about the perspectives that I might bring to the institution that I was not allowed to sit within the curatorial department. I was situated, or as I have argued, segregated on another floor and in another department. While I believe I was able to develop a good relationship with many of my curatorial peers, and 2.5 years later, after pressure from the museum's Latino Advisory Committee, I was eventually moved closer to the curators. I really missed that early personal and professional bonding moment that really colored my experience within the institution. And I mean that pun intended. I had a racialized experience at that institution. I never felt part of the curatorial team. I was not part of the inner circle. And I still remember that experience as unpleasant. My experience at my current institution has been better, yet other challenges awaited outside the institution, mostly coming from a critical establishment that is uninformed, resistant, and sometimes outright hostile to the work that I'm doing, which challenges accepted narratives. We can go to the next slide. So when I was appointed curator of Latino art at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, a local blogger wrote this post under the title, "Do art museums need curators for Latino art?" And what do you all think was his answer? No, right? This was, of course, before I worked a day at the museum. I hadn't even entered. This was after a press release, right? So the verdict was already in. The world does not need you. We don't need your perspectives. Next slide. Here's another example. When we unveiled my first major show at SAM, and here's a picture of the entrance to the show, a day after, the Washington Post art critic wrote a very antagonistic review that outright dismissed the exhibition in an article that was peppered with statements like, "Latino art today is a meaningless category." And I'm showing this here not because I want to contest his points. I have done that, I and others have done that in other contexts. In fact, I gave a CAA paper titled "Curating a Meaningless Category." I simply want to give a sense of the general hostility to which we and other curators of understudied and racialized fields are especially subjected to. There are many, many instances where we are just not welcomed. Right? Next slide. So the only way for many of us to have found a way to navigate, these challenges is really to have an army of mentors, role models, supporters, and encouragers that can help us make sense and push through these obstacles. So this slide represents many of the people who, in big and small ways, have helped me navigate my career. right? They include professors, role models from afar, which are really important, right? So I've never worked with Lowry Sims, but you better believe I went to every one of her exhibitions. You know, bosses who gave me the opportunity to learn and contribute, colleagues and peers who were supportive and offered a sounding board. And one thing that I want to point out to this group is that many of these people are not Latino, right? You don't have to be Latino to mentor a Latinx professional, right? That's not necessary, right? So the question for all of us is, if we care about inclusion, how do we formalize and stabilize these support structures? Because if we don't, it's going to be impossible to increase our ranks. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'd also like to begin by thanking everyone on this panel and AAMC for inviting me to this conversation, which is something that I think, has in many ways been happening informally for so many of us for so long. And I'll speak to that a little bit about the different types of conversations that are in their own way a form of mentorship. So I wanted to begin by thinking about, at least from my experience and perspective, what does mentorship really look like? And so I should preface this by saying these are my terms, these are my ideas. It's not necessarily rooted in any type of real science or theory. So of course there's what we I guess would consider a traditional mentorship relationship that is hierarchical, where you would have an experienced mentor helping out and teaching someone who is more emerging. Then there's the reciprocal relationship, which is where you have an experienced mentor and an emerging mentee, but they're sharing information and they're growing together. And then last, there's peer-to-peer, where you have two individuals who are colleagues and really at the same level, more or less in their careers, and they, again, are learning from each other, leaning on each other, and exchanging ideas. And I would say that although I have had a few people in my life that there was definitely more of a hierarchical relationship, the vast majority of mentorship experiences that I have and the relationships that I continue to lean on for professional support are reciprocal and peer-to-peer. Next slide, please. So after finishing my undergraduate studies at Rice University, where I majored in art history and was fortunate to have internships in Houston and DC, I took a position as an educator at the Museo Alameda. And the Alameda was a Smithsonian-affiliated museum that focused on Latino art, history, and culture. I say was because it no longer exists. After about, it's tough to say, but maybe 6 years in operation, maybe 5, the museum closed its doors due to financial trouble. When I joined, they had just undergone a huge staff turnover only a few months after opening, which meant that there were unprecedented opportunities for a very, very young museum professional. I was one of only a handful of people who had ever actually worked in a museum before. And for me, by worked, it meant was an intern. And so I quickly identified on the team 2 people that had a lot of experience, Ruben Luna and Heather Snow, exhibition coordinator and registrar, respectively. And right away, they were teaching me about best practices. And even in a very precarious landscape, in a very unconventional museum model, they taught me that best practices were the way that we were going to keep the doors open, quite literally. But I also had an unconventional mentor in the sense that our museum director, Eliseo Rios, he was actually the interim director, he came from a special events background. He had never worked in a nonprofit before. But he saw in me something, he saw my energy and my excitement, and he wanted to fuel that. And he identified opportunities for me that I was so fortunate to have at that point in my career. Everything from having me write intro panels for exhibitions to making sure that I had opportunities to meet some of the guest curators that we worked with. People like Rita Gonzalez, my now boss, Julie Rodriguez-Winholm, who was a curator at the MCA, I met her through this position. Eliseo also identified, although he wasn't, an expert in the arts, he understood business and wanted to make sure that I had a connection with the larger network of city leaders. And so through him, I became involved with the leadership program through the San Antonio Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, which, although none of those people really were involved in the arts, I got huge insight into how to communicate about my, arts and culture and the nonprofit world to the business sector, which has come in handy very much with the work that I do with donors and boards. So as the museum was beginning to show signs of financial trouble, I always knew that I would end up going to graduate school, but I decided it was probably time to kind of hit the gas on that plan. And I applied for programs around the country and ultimately was accepted into the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. I was terrified to leave a city that I loved and was so dear to me, and to leave my family. I had gone to college in Houston, so it was a huge step to move to Chicago, and it was going to be so cold. But it ended up being an awesome choice for me and opened so many doors. I don't have a slide about graduate school because that's not really what this panel is about, but suffice to say that I had a very positive experience, and with the help of several faculty members and other classmates, I was able to kind of create a path of coursework for myself that was in its own way kind of a critical race art history. So, next slide. So after I finished my graduate program, which was 3 years, I accepted the Curatorial Fellow for Diversity in the Arts position at the Walker in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And if I thought Chicago was cold, Minneapolis was even colder. I will say, one thing that kind of had helped me transition into Chicago was the diversity of the city. I recently read and was just shocked. It made sense, but there are 1 million Mexicans in Chicago. So there's actually more Mexicans in Chicago than there are in San Antonio, where I'm from. So it was, in a way, although culturally there were huge differences, because I am a 4th generation Mexican American, and there were definitely much more of an immigrant presence in Chicago, I still felt like there were literally people that looked like me, kind of spoke my language. That was not really the case at the Walker, unfortunately, or in Minneapolis. I definitely felt a sense of culture shock in going to Minneapolis. I moved with my partner, who's also a person of color, Latino, and there would sometimes be days, if our director at Olga Viso, who is Cuban American, if she was out of the office, there could be days that I wouldn't see another brown person. And that was strange. That was really unusual. The position that I had was about supporting other curators and major exhibitions that they were working on. But I would say this was probably the most public-facing role that I have ever had. The curatorial staff of the Walker was known within the arts community. I met people very early on that were like, "Oh, you're the new fellow, I've heard about you," and total strangers. I felt that I had to represent the institution at all times. And that's a tremendous amount of pressure to feel straight out of graduate school, but it's also challenging when you're at an institution that's going through a transition. And they had a few different leadership roles that were in flux while I was there, and they also had a few issues with the community that there was a lot of questions about access and visibility within the organization. There was an open letter that was written to the Walker very soon after I started pertaining to the community's access to a screening of 12 Years a Slave. And essentially, tickets had been made available to the members first, and it sold out. So if you weren't a member of the Walker, you didn't get a ticket. It was a policy that perhaps should have been reevaluated before the tickets went on sale. It was also something that was in the film department and I had nothing to do with. But nevertheless, people that I knew casually, people that I met at parties, would come up to me and say, "Why is the Walker so racist?" And, over a beer, I was expected to explain essentially, decades of institutionalized prejudice and questions, that I hadn't fully figured out myself, and that was really tough. And as I struggled to find the voice that I needed to share that with my colleagues within the institution. And although I definitely built up a network of stakeholders and peers within the Walker, I didn't necessarily have like the direct one-on-one mentorship. Olga did a really wonderful job of including me on a very significant project, which was the 75th anniversary exhibition for the museum. And I worked side by side with her and learned so much professional practices. But there was also still I struggled in trying to understand how, other than her, there really wasn't anyone else that looked like me or shared my interest in emerging artists, perhaps artists that weren't necessarily represented by the same 10 galleries in New York. And during curatorial meetings, I sometimes felt like a little bit like a fish out of water. I'm really fortunate that I also worked very closely with the Walker's amazing magazine editor, Paul Schmelzer. If you have not been following the Walker social media, you should. They have an outstanding publishing platform that has really made huge strides in inclusion and diversity over the years. They really single-handedly have, I think, changed the landscape of digital publishing within museums. And he showed me how to use the institution as a platform, and something that I still, reflect on to this day. So after I finished at the Walker, I feel like I'm leaving out something significant that I'll probably have to mention later. But after I finished at the Walker, I was in flux and needed to figure out where was the best place for me to continue my career. I sought advice from so many different people about what was the best fit for me. And during this time, I worked on freelance projects. I did some independent research. And next slide. I also participated in the National Association of Latino Arts and Culture Leadership Institute. And so you'll see, this is a photo of my cohort, and center is Tomás Ibarra Frausto, who is really kind of the godfather of Latinx art history in the United States. He has somebody that really has quite literally written the book on so many of the topics that are important to the field, and someone who I'm fortunate to have interfaced with at many points throughout my career. This Leadership Institute and really the larger, broader NALAC network have proven invaluable to me in terms of knowing that there is a community of people who have my back. I should say, we didn't touch on this, but I think we have a slide later that is also the Latino Museum Studies program at the Smithsonian. Similarly, a network of colleagues who have similar interests and goals, and I know that those are people that I can tap into. So during this time, Julie Rodriguez-Woodholm, who's the director of the DePaul Art Museum, let me know that there was an opportunity that was coming up at the DePaul Art Museum for an assistant curator job. And the stars aligned, and I was able to move back to Chicago to pursue that role. But before I took that job, she and I had a really important conversation about essentially the values that she wanted to instill in the organization. I made it clear to her that I was looking for mentorship on the job, and she made it clear to me that it was important that we had the same value system. So together, with our very small 4-person staff, we have cultivated a mission to support artists of color, LGBTQ artists, women artists, and Chicago artists, and to expand the canon of art history. This August will be 2 years that I've been there, and I'm really happy with the work that we're doing. I'm continuing to try to grow and expand our network, and I'm also having interns of my own and trying to teach them best practices as well. Next slide. So this is the DePaul Art Museum. For those of you who haven't visited, we are located just 10 minutes away from downtown Chicago at the Fullerton Red and Brown Line stop. I'm almost always there, so please reach out if you'd like a tour. Let's go to the next slide. So going back to what does mentorship really look like, as I outlined, there's these 3 different types of relationships, and as you heard me, talk about, many of them kind of were peer-to-peer. Or reciprocal. However, as I began to prepare this presentation, something that really jumped out at me was the fact that, you can come next. Ultimately, what I had built were networks that were both community and familial networks. As I considered, who really has supported me and been a champion for me, there are many people in small ways, but the biggest ways have been two individuals. So on the left, that's my mom, and my mom was the first person that ever took me to a museum, of course. She took me to the San Antonio Museum of Art as well as, the Met, but also the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center. She taught me early on that my own cultural heritage was really important and something to be celebrated. She taught me that art is everywhere and also that it is invaluable. It was fun looking at pictures for this slideshow because I had so many with her in different museums around the country. And then on the right, that is my abuelita. She left school in 8th grade. Although she was not educated, she knew the importance of education and instilled that in her children and, of course, in me. I loved to take her on tours of the different museums and projects that I had worked on, and I knew she was always a good litmus test if I was ready to really give a tour, because she would ask the hard questions like, why is this art? Or, I just don't get it. And so I learned from her, or I developed through her, the skills of being able to distill very complex ideas into simple sentences. And I also learned from her to hold my head up high and to not ever feel ashamed for not knowing something. She passed away on Saturday, and I dedicate this to her.
Hello. Thank you for having me. I'm honored to be here. My name is Lisa Corona, and I am a 4th generation Mexican American, 1st generation college graduate, 1st generation graduate degree recipient, and first person in my family to work in any sort of art capacity. Growing up, I grew up in the Inland Valley of Southern California, and I recall when I first moved to Temecula, is what it's called. I walked into my 4th grade class, and a girl assumed that I didn't speak any English. The community was predominantly white, and I've always just grown up in these predominantly white areas. So even though as a child, my parents would often talk about racism and the kind of discrimination that they experienced growing up, it wasn't until I got to college that my eyes were really opened as to just how lacking in diversity the institution is as a whole, including academia. So first slide. The only Latina mentor I have is my mom, hands down. Neither of my parents went to college. They were both working class from Santa Paula, California, which is a farming community. My father was in the Marine Corps for 22 years. My mom did everything from graveyard shift for 10 years at Kmart so that she could be home with us while we were in school. I have a younger brother. To meat wrapping and grocery stores. But for us, growing up, higher education was never an option. You had to go. It was just, you will go to college. I don't care what you're studying. You have to get that degree because no one can ever take that away from you. But in retrospect, going through my years of education, I realized that really the only person I ever had to go to talk about the issues that I was facing as a young woman of color was my mother. So next slide, thank you. So K through 12, because I was a military kid, I was in 5 different schools, 2 in San Diego County. 20% of the population in 1990 was Latina. 3 in Riverside County, 26% Latina. Through K through 5, 0 teachers who were Latino. Number of white women teachers, all of them. Number of Latina teachers through 6th through high school. I had 1, and of course she taught Spanish. The rest were all white. So it was never really something that was provided for me in terms of seeing this visibility and something that I could relate to in school. When I would bring up issues of being Chicana, I would have teachers, even in college and graduate school, say to me, well, you don't look Mexican, so we really don't know what you're talking about, and I really don't know if that experience is relevant for you to be discussing here through your work. Next slide, please. College will be better, right? No. So I went to school at UCSD for undergrad, UC San Diego. And growing up in San Diego, being such a majority population of Latinos, I thought for sure once I got to college I would see more brown faces. Absolutely not. Next slide, please. I was there from 2000 to 2005. In 2005, the University of California did a faculty diversity study. Out of 1,800 professors across the UCs, only 44 were Latino. I don't even know the number that were Chicano. And just to bring that up again, like, Latinos are very different. We're not a homogeneous group. So every time that we're lumped together, it can often feel like those of us who feel very closely connected to our individual heritage are, in a sense, taken a little less seriously because you're just thinking about Latinx as one big group. Next, please. So then I went to graduate school right after undergrad. I was young, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, and my parents, I originally went to college to study medicine. I had wanted to be a doctor since I was 6. That was gonna be like my parents' ticket out of poverty. And then when I was in college, I was like, sorry guys, I really like to paint. And they were like, okay. So as whatever makes you happy. And my mom, however, was like, you really need to have a backup plan. So I said, no worries, I'm gonna go to grad school, get my MFA, and then I'll just become a professor. Easy peasy. So I was 22, I left graduate school at 24. And while I was there, I had 2 Latino mentors, kind of. So Gabriel Martinez is a Cuban-American photographer, and he was fabulous. However, during the course of that experience, out of 4 Latinos in the program, was passed over multiple times for these like group exhibitions that focused on Latino artists. And I was always so confused and like hurt, but it was because the work that I was making wasn't about being Latina. I just happened to be Latina. So in order to be included in some of these exhibitions, everything had to be about that. And what I really struggled with was being pigeonholed, but also feeling like there was a place for me in these spaces. So a turning point was seeing the Phantom Sighting show at MoCA Los Angeles, curated by Rita Gonzalez. That show just like blew me away because there were so many incredible artists who happened to be Chicano, making really critical and informed and thoughtful work that may have been 2, 10, 20 steps away from the Latino experience. And that was the kind of work that I was trying to make. Next slide, please. I had Coco Fusco for 2 hours during my 2 years there. That was really just so invigorating. The entire time, bless her heart, I really do enjoy Ms. Fusco's work. But at the time I was making video work, so of course everything was just compared to what she had previously done in the 70s, which was not helpful, but neither here nor there. And again, the Cuban American experience is very different, being a cash poor working class Chicana growing up in San Diego. It's just a very, they're 2 different worlds. So just because we're rooted in like Spanish language and this like shared, you know, colonialism. Like there's still so much that differs within the Latino experience that it was just very difficult to find that kind of kinship. Next slide, please. So when I graduated from graduate school, as Carmen mentioned, being working class, I did not have the opportunity or the privilege to take unpaid internships or low-paying jobs because I had to pay back my loans. So I ended up working in upper administration for a for-profit college, and it like killed my soul the whole time that I was there. I was there for 4 years. But I knew like my heart was still in art, and I decided finally it was time to go out and pursue my dream. And as Carmen mentioned again, I started in education. Next slide, please. And in 2013, I got my first position at a contemporary art institution in San Diego called Lux Art Institute, where I started as the teaching artist, and within a month became the lead educator, and then within a year became the education director, mostly because of such high turnover, and I lasted. I've always just been somebody who, despite my accomplishments, I've always felt so much of what I've worked hard for in some ways has been out of spite, sorry, because of the kind of cards that are stacked against me growing up. Even within my own extended family, when I was in college, I was one of the only of all of my cousins, the only person to go to college. So I was taught by my aunts and uncles that I was wasting my time. I should just go straight into the workforce. And then you tell them that you're studying art. Well, what for? Like, that's not gonna make you money. You're not gonna, you know, you're really gonna be struggling. So at Lux Art Institute, again, I didn't have a mentor. I was the only person of color on the staff. And my executive director was also the founder, so suffered from founder syndrome, and anything that I brought to the table would kind of get like stepped on or refuted, yet I was the only person on staff who had an MFA. And so my entire time there, I felt like I was just trying to prove myself to survive, while at the same time, being the person who doesn't ask permission, but begs for forgiveness after the fact. So I would start my own programs. I was in the education department in a different building. I started a mentorship program. I started a teen collective. I would meet up with teen girls after hours and would help them with their portfolios as they were trying to get admitted into college. I provided opportunities for young women of color to curate just tiny pop-up shows within that space. And one of my mentees is now in her 3rd year at NYU and is working on curating an exhibition out there. So all of the things that I have wanted for myself being in this field, I've decided to create, because it's not going to be made for me, and I don't ever want a younger person to go through the system feeling that lack of support. After Lux Art Institute, I was at the San Diego Art Institute, which was the only contemporary art space in Balboa Park, which is like the cultural hub of San Diego. And while I was there, once again, I was, you know, the only person of color on staff. Came in as the education director, was making very little money. And when the executive director exited, they put me in as the interim, and it was that very first day, the staff and I all got together, and I was like, we need to determine what we want for this space. as a group, as a collective, as like, let's eliminate this hierarchical model and let's really work together and think about the needs, not just for us, but for our community. What is our community lacking that we can provide? And so we curated, I co-curated with my collaborator, Marina Grais, who's the creative director at SDAI, the largest LGBTQ exhibition and the most diverse exhibition in San Diego Art Institute's 76-year history. It was phenomenal, and for the first time, people actually came to us and said that they felt like they had a home, like that space was welcoming. So going back to that whole like familial level of engagement, I think so much of that, personally for me, is cultural. At every institution I've worked at, I want people to walk through those doors and feel like they are at home. I want people to feel welcomed, to engage, to ask those difficult questions. I want art to really serve its purpose as a tool for communication for everyone. So when I hear sometimes these code words of like accessibility and diversity, if the audience isn't reflecting that, then there's a lot more work that needs to be done. And the only way I truly believe that you can get a genuine and sincere effort for inclusion is to pull up those seats at the table for women of color, specifically women of color. And otherwise, we're gonna flip the table and create our own space. So yes, currently I am teaching full-time at a middle school art program, which is very different, but it's like, again, that form of mentorship that I believe so strongly in, where, you know, just after one trimester, I've had several students who said they hated art, and now they actually understand it better, and they're shocked that it could be a career path for them. And this is at a private school, and I have several of my 8th graders who are asking questions about how we can use our resources to bring art programs to public schools that are lacking them. So once again, I think it's just being really open to accepting the opportunities that are thrown your way, but also creating those opportunities when you don't see them available. And really just figuring out a path that you can let more people in to really change the way the institution functions, in that it can serve everyone. So I think that's it. Is that it?
So before we move on, we're going to open it up to questions. But before that, I really want to thank everybody here on this stage for opening up and being so honest about your experiences. This has been an amazing experience for me, kind of with these resonating sort of paths, you know, up into the curatorial field. And what we found was that 3 of us actually attended the LMSP program through the Smithsonian Latino Center. So we dug up our cohort photos, and you can see them up there. So we'd like to thank you for being a wonderful audience, and we would like to open it up for questions. Or comments.
Hi, so this is a question for Carmen and Mia. Mia, you said something that when you went to the Walker, you went to an event or something, and someone said, "Oh, I know you, I've heard about you." So I guess my question, you know, using that experience as a kind of base point, is how do you maintain the agency when many museums, this is kind of a good thing for them, you know, to hire and to show that they're hiring, they're being diverse and they're hiring, you know, minorities. But how do you maintain that agency? You know, you don't want to feel you're being instrumentalized, but at the same time, you know, you want to use this as a platform to mentor other younger generations and for them to see that, you know, people like them are going up the ranks in the curatorial field?
So that's a really great question. And I would say I learned as I went. I think I realized, you know, early on that, you know, the Curatorial Fellowship for Diversity in the Arts is a long-running program, and many outstanding curators have come through it. And it's a wonderful first step into the field. However, it's not without its flaws. When I was going through the program, the salary was extremely low, and that was a struggle for me. I also felt that although I did have a direct supervisor, and that was definitely, you know, a great mentorship relationship, Siri Engberg, I also felt like there maybe needed to be a little bit more structure to that type of guidance and mentorship, particularly for someone like me who this was my first curatorial job. I had worked in museums before, but not quite in that capacity and at that pace and level. So in terms of, you know, the agency, I realized I needed to, as painful as it was in some ways, because I was just coming out of my shell, I needed to use my voice whenever I could to speak up for the things I believed in. So as I mentioned, you know, sometimes I felt like artists that I was interested in were not necessarily being brought to the table. So whenever I had a chance, when they were like, oh, who are some, you know, interesting young artists that we should be thinking about, I only mentioned artists of color. I was going to claim space for artists of color. So that was one strategy I did that helped me feel like I was being true to myself and, you know, representing my interest. I think another way that I asserted agency was the way that I gave tours, the way that I interacted with the general public, you know, the stories that I chose to tell in the galleries, you know, both with my contributions to exhibitions, but also just the narratives that I helped develop, you know, for the public. And then I would say last, although I did a lot of work with, you know, the board and the donors, and, you know, I think working with that constituency was a strength of mine, I also made sure to prioritize doing studio visits and meeting younger artists, meeting artists who perhaps were marginalized or hadn't been ever, you know, had a studio visit with like a Walker curator. It was important to me to democratize that space in a way. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I guess your question made me think about my new role as Deputy Chief Curator at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and the Chief Curator, Virginia Mecklenburg, encouraged me to apply for the position. And I know that when I did that, I thought about, well, you know, I don't want to be a token. You know, don't put me in that role if I'm just there because, oh, we have diversity at this high level, right? So I was sort of very conscious of that. And I think about that constantly, right? That almost makes me want to have even more agency, right? I'm not going to be a token. I'm not going to have this be an empty gesture, right? But now at this table, I'm at this place where I have the opportunity to speak, and I need to use those opportunities very wisely. At the same time, that's not easy. It's not easy to do that. It's not easy to do that when you've been a person of color your whole life, right? And you've had to fight your whole life, and you've had to even you've internalized certain absences, right? So there's always an internal struggle, right? I think for people of color and living in this society. And the other thing that I wanted to say is that inclusion breeds inclusion, right? So one of the things that has happened since my position was created and since other positions were created across the Smithsonian through the Latino Curatorial Initiative. So there are many curatorial positions now at the National Portrait Gallery, at American History, at the African American Museum, at Anacostia, at Cooper Hewitt, is that now we've seen a surge in our fellowship applications for pre-doctoral and postdoctoral fellowships focused on Latinx issues. And that's really important, right? So it kind of, inclusion breeds inclusion.
One thing I forgot to mention, Marcella, everything that I told you and a version of what I said in my presentation, I told to HR as I left. So it wasn't, that was important to me in terms of agency, that I articulate my reflection and my experience in a very honest way to try to improve circumstances for whoever came after me.
Similarly, when I left the San Diego Art Institute, I had applied for the permanent executive director position, and I was the only applicant that was asked to provide a outline for the future of the organization. I complied, and every single bullet point had something to do with cultural equity, and because they're all interrelated. All of these things that I wanted for this space, that I believed we could provide within this space, came back to accessibility. And when I went for my interview with the board members, who were predominantly white men, and I would mention cultural equity a few times, the vice chair just cut me off and said, "I don't know what you're talking about. What does that mean, cultural equity?" And was very abrasive. And so I spoke about the fact that the history of our shows had been predominantly white men who'd been showing, and our staff was predominantly white. And we're living in San Diego. We need to provide more opportunities. I did not get the job. Rather, a woman who, with zero contemporary art experience, did not have a master's degree even, but was friends with someone on the board, received that position, was making $40,000 more than I was as the interim. And the board actually had asked me, "Well, we want you to stay, but in your original role as the education director at your original salary for $36,000 a year." So, I actually have a question for Carmen, because as I have come up through the ranks and within these different spaces and really kind of challenged some of these things and have been vocal and tried to, really lead with my own agency in mind, how have you dealt with pushback? Because I haven't figured it out. I was even told by another director that my facial antics are offensive. So any advice you can give is well.
Again, that's why I said you need an army of supporters. It's not just you need an army of people to back you up, to help you put things in perspective. And I'll just give you for instance, I remember when I bought the work of Delilah Montoya. I was thinking about acquiring some of her work, and she did these beautiful photographs taken on the border between the United States and Mexico, in Native American communities where there were Native American communities, the same Native American community that lived on both sides of the border. So she was kind of questioning these narratives of borders, but from a different perspective, from the angle of Native American communities. A wonderful project. And I remember when I first bought these works to our curatorial team about acquiring them, I got a very negative response from some people. And literally, and I was just, that paralyzed me for maybe 3 weeks. I was just then what the heck am I doing here? What am I doing here? If you can't accept this, then why am I here, right? And I needed 3 weeks to process that, right? To figure out how to negotiate that. It's not immediate, right? You have to think of the long term, and that's my thinking again. Think back to the 1993 biennial, the Whitney Biennial, right? All those artists were totally dismissed, and now they're major artists. You have to think long term. It's not immediate.
Thank you.
Okay, so wait, great.
Is this the only
There's
microphone?
somebody up front here and somebody over there.
The person that has the microphone already.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I have a sort of a twofold question. And we're in the process, or we will be in the next 6 months, hiring a new curatorial assistant at sort of an entry level. So my question for you is the first simpler question is, how can I make sure that I'm getting this job application in front of a wide variety of students who might be interested in the position, to make sure that I have the most people possible applying for it. Maybe through, I don't know if you have some access through the Getty program or something like that, some way where I can publish this job announcement. And the second one is, as an institution that's relatively small in a city that may be whiter than Minneapolis, I don't know. What can I do to make sure that if somebody comes from outside of the city, or if somebody comes to my institution, that they feel like they're being mentored or comfortable, or what should I avoid?
Well, I want to make maybe a comment related to that, and thinking about Gabby's question at the beginning, like what do we consider, how do we define diversity? And it's sort of related to your question. And I was talking to Gabby earlier about, we have these definitions of diversity. Of course, it's difference of culture, sexual orientation, gender identity, religion, blah, blah, blah. But I've seen recently in several museums that are adopting statements on diversity, equity, and inclusion, they are adding this thing about difference in personal experiences and different skills. And to that point, I think it's very important to consider people that have, different backgrounds and take risks. Because sometimes if you have two candidates, one is white and one is a person of color, and they have the same sort of, you like them both, and they have the same qualities, but maybe one of them has a PhD, the other doesn't, but has, more experience. Just take risks. I think that is like a very important thing. I think that, for example, I always ask myself, like, how did I end up at the Getty Foundation? And I think that they took a risk with me. And I always value that. I think that I also have asked myself if I'm a token, because I entered through this, Pacific Standard Time LA initiative, and also I'm working now with the MUI program, the Multicultural Undergraduate Internship Program. And I think that, no, like I feel like Carmen said, like I am empowering myself, and I am taking these steps to go beyond what is expected of me, and also bring my practice into it. So I think that one of the most important things is to take risks. And also, if you want to send your post, we can distribute it. There's an MUI alumni page, and I also belong to several pages on Facebook that are people of color in the arts, and so we can repost it, and then you can get a diverse pool of applicants that way.
Yeah, and just to echo Selene, I mean, speaking from experience, if I can teach like middle school and high school kids who have like no experience in the art how to curate an exhibition, really think of it that way. These skills can be taught on the job. So maybe look for somebody whose values kind of reflect, and perspectives kind of reflect where you want to be eventually, as opposed to maybe where your institution is right now. But like these skills can be taught on the job. So really, education and experience in a way. And we talk about this a lot. What does diversification mean? It means bringing people who didn't have opportunities, like a lot of us didn't have, earlier on.
Do we have time for a question? One more question. Yeah.
All right. I don't want to be the last question. I have a fear And I'm really humble and moved by your presentation today, and I would love your advice. I've been working with a number of colleagues in Boston, and we have a notion to address a lot of the cultural inequity that is very real that we've been talking about in the curatorial field with an idea of a co-mentorship program as opposed to a one-way mentorship program. And by that I mean, I think with curators inside institutions, there may be a presumption that experience and background is valued in a different way than curators outside of institutions, but putting them together to learn from each other. But my significant fear in developing this program is I keep being told there is going to be resistance and reluctance within the institutions to accept the consultation and expertise and advice of a colleague from outside of the institution as equal and as valuable to theirs. And I would love your feedback and your thoughts on, one, if you think the idea is viable, and two, if you have recommendations.
I have some thoughts about it, I mean, with just a little bit that you've shared. And I think from an individual perspective, one thing that is very tiring for, I feel like I can stretch and speak for all of us, is the expectation that we, on top of everything else with our jobs, we also have to educate. And I would say that if you were asking for individuals or organizations that are predominantly people of color to take on this role, to really think about what is fair compensation, what does a truly fair exchange look like, and I think that that would actually benefit the other institution as well. You know, I don't know that there's necessarily going to be one contract that will work for each organization. You know, for let's say there's an arts organization that's really education focused, and they work with a nonprofit that is working with youth. What looks like a equitable exchange for them might be different than for an encyclopedic museum and a gallery, for instance. So I would say to really customize and again experiment, and to have things perhaps be a little bit fluid, at least at the beginning, to really understand and have both organizations be honest with each other about what they need.
So the Getty overall, we're undergoing a process where we're discussing issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Hopefully that, to have a statement really soon. But there are a lot of task force groups that are discussing these things. And one thing that has been brought to the table is a mentorship program within the Getty. And in the discussions on how to approach it, I think that one of the last versions of it is that instead of going from bottom up, go top down and ask who from the top is interested in being part. So people don't feel forced to be part of it, and you get people that are really, really interested in this opportunity, and then you can do matchmaking from there. So I don't know.
Okay, thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.